You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 220 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we are discussing terrestrial crocs.
Some kind of special time of the year or something?
It is Croc Month, so we are having a crocky episode and discussing a topic I am extremely excited to get into the details on.
Land crocs.
Land crocs. We are going to be discussing the many varieties of terrestrial, land-bound crocodilomorphs that have lived on our planet over the millions of years that we've had crocodilomorphs. And there's probably way more than many people suspect, since today they are so famously not land crocs. But in the past, that was not always the case. They were actually quite commonly found running around on land. So we'll discuss what it means to be terrestrial, go through some of the main groups, and talk about what their diversity was and how we can tell when we're looking at a terrestrial croc in the fossil record.
Yeah, we've mentioned a lot of these land crocs over the history of the podcast. This will be a fun opportunity to put them all in one place and go over the similarities and differences and trends.
Yes, I'm so excited. We are discussing this because it is Croc Month, but also because it was requested. This, or topics within it, were requested by Daikaiju Fanboy, Do You Think Esaurus, Josiah, Johannes, Catherine, Ioselectus, Evan, Piero, and Big Boss Man.
Thank you, everybody, as always, for all these wonderful requests.
Yes, excellent taste, all of you, in my opinion. Before we get into the episode itself, some quick announcements. First and foremost, as always, we have a Patreon, and donations and support from our patrons on that Patreon keep the podcast running top to bottom. When you sign up with us on Patreon, you can get extra goodies, extra content, bonus episodes, bonus noise, live streams, all that good stuff. And at certain levels, you can get your names shouted out here at the beginning of the podcast. So for this episode, we would like to welcome Georgia, David, Argentavis, Hugh, and Jamie.
Thank you all for your incredible support. Hey, right now, if you support the podcast at certain levels, you get to support even more than us because it's Croc Month.
Yes, it is. So the Croc tier is open and ready for patronage. If you sign up there, not only do you get the typical benefits that level will get you, but you'll get Croc and Snake stickers, and your donation will contribute to our contributions to snake and croc conservation, and this year to the protections of our national parks.
Yes, we'll be donating every year to the Crocodilian Research Coalition and to Save the Snakes. And this year we are adding on the National Parks Conservation Association for the protection of these wonderful environments around us here across North America, which include snakes and crocs and some other animals probably.
Yes, some less important, but we still want to keep them around.
and food for the crocs and snakes.
Yes, exactly. They need to maintain the ecosystem for our crocs and snakes to live in.
On top of the bonus Patreon tier, which is only available during Croc and Snake Month, so sign up now. Also, Croc Chat is open on the Discord, and we will be having a Croc Month live stream actually tomorrow. So by the time this is released, you will have missed the opportunity if you didn't do it. But the actual live stream video will be available for rewatch on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it either to see what you missed or to relive the incredible memories from being.
Speaking of exciting croc and snake stuff, another thing we have is a mailing address where people can send us mailed in goodies, and we got some fun mail. First off, we got some postcards from Elizabeth that are Lake Superior postcards and talking about the geology. Yeah, it's good stuff there. And from other Elizabeth, so two Elizabeths sending us stuff.
Elizabeth Prime.
Yes, our Elizabeth cup overfloweth. Elizabeth sent us snake and croc goodies. We got socks, we got pendants, we got little figurines, we got postcard from the Australia Zoo, and a patch, a croc and snake patch from the Australia Zoo. So just a bunch of really great things. And stickers.
Yeah, and these seem to be purchases that are associated with conservation efforts.
Yes.
So these are I think the postcard makes a comment about this. These purchases contribute to protection of wildlife and habitats and such. Very cool stuff.
Yeah, so thank you for all of that. Thank you for your contributions. Also, those stickers, that artist I love those stickers and that artist. So thank you so much. Like, those arts are some of my favorites. On the note of cool interactions with our listeners.
And foreign museums.
In foreign museums, absolutely. We have a museum meet and greet with David coming up.
Yeah, I am going to be on July 19th at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta. Not only me, but also Nora of Leave It to Us fame. Leave It to Us, now halfway through season 1. Go check it out wherever you find your podcast. Nora and I are going to be at the Royal Tyrrell Museum on Saturday, July 19th, and we are turning it into a museum meetup. So details are still being hashed out, but probably sometime in the afternoon of that day, we will officially set a time where you can come say hi, where we can explore some of the museum together. And if things go well, maybe say hi to some of the people that work at the museum as well. Should be a bunch of fun. If you are considering coming to join us, let us know. You can send us an email. You can pop over to the Discord and let us know there. That's nice because it gives us a sense of how many people to expect ahead of time. Last time we did a museum meetup at the Gray Fossil site, it was super, super fun. We are also still planning to do one later in the year in Atlanta. Details on that before too long. But if you are in the Drumheller, Alberta area, come say hi and look for on our website and on our Discord for the details when they are ready.
Yeah, so pop in if you would like to hang out with David and Nora. And with that, we can wrap up the announcements and move on to our first official section of the episode, which is the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent paleontological, earth science, evolutionary studies and discuss them here on the podcast so we can all stay up to date. David, what's the news?
My first bit of news is about archosaurs, sticking with the theme.
Excellent.
Particularly dinosaurs and the stuff that they ate.
Eee.
This is research published in Current Biology by Stephen Poropat et al. There's a whole bunch of authors on this paper, and one of them is friend of the podcast, Adele Pentland.
Hey!
Very cool stuff. Congratulations, Adele, and everybody else on this paper. And in the blog post, we will link to an article on the conversation by Stephen Poropat. This research concerns a specimen of a sauropod, Diamantinosaurus, from Queensland. Diamantinosaurus is a sauropod, which is the big, big dinosaurs with the long necks and the long tails. This is a specific skeleton that was excavated back in 2017 that was nicknamed Judy. Judy was in the news and making headlines because it is a very complete, well-preserved sauropod fossil. It comes from the Winton Formation around 95 million years ago during the middle part of the Cretaceous, excavated from the outback of Queensland. And the name Judy is nicknamed after Judy Elliott, co-founder of Australian Age of Dinosaurs Museum.
Cool.
This paper does a nice description of the specimen of Diamantinosaurus. It is a fairly complete subadult, so not fully grown, not a little baby, but not yet fully adult. It is the most complete sauropod fossil ever found in Australia thus far.
Awesome.
And it is also the first example of a sauropod dinosaur in Australia that has some remains of fossilized skin.
Ooh.
But this paper and a lot of the articles that are being written about it are focused on another exceptional thing about this specimen, and that is that it has gut contents. There is this chunk of rock, basically, this particular rock layer that is within the abdomen of the skeleton and along the inner surface of the fossilized skin patches.
Whoa.
Which is really useful because it is really difficult to determine for sure that gut contents are gut contents.
Mm-hmm.
So having it surrounded in part by the skin is very helpful information. And it is full of plant remains, which also helps to support that. This is exciting because, as much as we talk about the diets of dinosaurs, actual definitive gut contents for herbivorous dinosaurs are almost unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the paper, they describe, if I remember correctly from reading the paper, there are 3 examples of agreed upon for sure gut contents for herbivorous dinosaurs. There's a bunch of like coprolites associated. There's been a bunch of studies on teeth and isotopes, but actual food remains in the gut, there are only a handful and none for sauropods.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a lot rarer than I had realized it was. This makes this the first, not only it's the first gut contents for a sauropod, but the first direct evidence of sauropod diets. We've had all of this other great indirect evidence, but this is the first time. Within this chunk of gut contents, there's a bunch of plant remains. Mostly the plants are preserved as voids within the coprolite, so the empty space where the plant material once was. The researchers used X-ray analysis. They also took some samples for chemical analysis to do a whole survey of what is inside this cololite. They find conifer leaves and angiosperm leaves and some fruiting bodies from seed ferns.
Mm-hmm.
And their chemical analysis identified biomarkers that are consistent with both gymnosperms and angiosperms. So a variety of different plant stuff. The condition of these gut contents provides some insights into sauropod feeding habits and mostly provides direct support for a bunch of stuff that we have always suspected about sauropods, but haven't actually had direct evidence for. For example, most of the plant remains are intact pieces. They are not very heavily broken up, which suggests that this dinosaur wasn't doing a lot of chewing, which has been suspected based on the shape of their teeth and also everything about sauropods. The fact that there's a whole bunch of different types of plants represented there, there's conifers, there's flowering plants, there's seed ferns, suggests that they were a generalized feeder, that this was just eating whatever it could get, also suspected about sauropods. And they also point out in the paper that at this time, conifers, pine tree-like things, would have been quite tall, but flowering plants at this time were mostly low-growing, which suggests that this dinosaur was feeding at different height levels, in addition to eating a variety of different plants. We've talked about sauropod diets on the podcast before, episode 101. Sauropods are generally thought to have been indiscriminate bulk feeders.
Yes.
That you are so big and so much of sauropod anatomy seems to be specialized for taking in as much food as possible, which seems to be what it needs to do to be an animal the size of a sauropod. This is gut contents that supports all of that. This dinosaur was eating a whole variety of different foods, not chewing them very much, just vacuuming up plants wherever it could reach them.
So cool. Like you said, none of this is overturning our expectations or rewriting the way we have to interpret, because these are all things we suspected and predicted, which is often what happens with gut contents, that you look like you eat these things. We finally find you with gut content. You have those things in your gut because the shape of an animal's body and teeth give you really good insights into what it's doing.
Yes.
But it feels very comforting to now have gut content because sauropods are so weird. They're such extreme animals that our estimates beforehand, I always was like, but how correct can we be with an animal so different from anything we know?
Well, and it's also a really nice reinforcement that our methods of analyzing these animals' diets are accurate.
Yes.
We've spent decades studying their teeth and their anatomy and their environments to come up with how do we think these animals were eating. And this, we have gut contents that confirms pretty much exactly what we had concluded, which
Yep.
is great information, but it's also one of those discoveries that's like, all right, cool, we're doing it right. This gives us that much more confidence in all the other dinosaurs we've been interpreting that we don't yet have gut contents for, which is very cool. Now, the paper does point out that even though these results line up with our expectations, this is one dinosaur. So different sauropods are still specialized for different things. So Diamantinosaurus's diet might not be the same as other sauropods. They also point out that Judy, this particular specimen, is not fully grown.
True.
So there's also the possibility that their feeding habits changed as they got older. I think in the paper they specifically talk about, like, Judy seems to have been eating at all different levels of the habitat. It's possible that adults, fully grown adults, might have specifically specialized in high growing plants, and feeding low growing stuff might be something that the juveniles are doing. So this one specimen is very informative, but there are still limitations on how much of this we can generalize out to all sauropods.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. And sauropods were a hugely diverse group, so there definitely could be ones that are quite specialized in their feeding and would not match this pattern very closely at all. So hopefully we can find more sauropod guts like this.
Yes. Adele, keep finding sauropod dinosaurs with gut contents.
Yes, no, your mission, if you should accept it, because this is awesome. Well, my news is about research that's using a technique to identify fossil organisms using ancient collagen.
All right.
This is research by Carly Peters et al. In Frontiers in Mammal Science, and the article is by Murgakshi Dixit in Interesting Engineering. This study was looking at a issue that we have with many fossil records, but specifically they're looking at Australia's, in that there are a bunch of records for different areas of the world or different groups where we have fossils, but the fossils are really fragmentary. We don't get nice complete specimens. We get just pieces and parts, and many times those pieces and parts are not in the best condition. Different places just aren't as kind to fossils based on the rock that they fossilized in initially or the ecosystem that's been there since. So
not every fossil is a complete sauropod with gut content.
Yes. Yeah, this is the opposite end.
Skin remains.
Of the spectrum. Which means that when we have situations like that, it can often be difficult to correctly identify what you have. When you just have a fragment, you might be able to get it in a general group, but not down to species. Even if it already is a species we know, we still might not be able to confirm it. This study was looking at another way to identify ancient fossils. There have been lots of, updates in biomolecular paleontology and archaeology in recent years. We've talked about ancient DNA. This is looking at ancient collagen.
Mm-hmm.
And so DNA famously breaks down extremely quickly. It does not last very long. Even in the best conditions for it, it typically does not last much more than maybe 1,000,000 years at the very top range. Collagen is much more resilient, and so it can last much longer in fossils. Collagen is a protein found in bones, skin, muscles, as well as other parts of the body, but these are three of the common places. It can endure for potentially millions of years. There have been reports of collagen in dinosaur fossils, though I don't know if those are debated, so I'm not going to go into detail on those. But this is another biomarker that can be identified in certain fossils and can be used to identify species and taxa groups.
Yeah, the same way that DNA can have specific features you could link to different groups of life. The structure of collagen can also do that.
Exactly. This is a relatively newer method, and what they're using is specifically called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, ZooMS, and this is the tool they're using to analyze the collagen. And here they are looking at specimens from 3 Australian megafauna species. They wanted to do this both to test the process, because these are all species we already know and that these fossils have been identified. They want to see if this method will corroborate those identifications and is an accurate tool, and because most of this kind of research has been done on Eurasian fossils, so there's not been a lot done in Australia. So they're hoping to use this study as a way to point out that this could be used on the Australian record as well. The 3 species they chose is Zygomaturus trilobus, which is a hippo-sized wombat,
Mm-hmm.
Protymnodon mamcura, which is a giant kangaroo, and Palerchestes azalea, which is another big marsupial. This is one of the weirder ones where it's got big forepaws and often is interpreted as having some sort of trunk or big mobile upper lip. They analyzed the collagen from these fragmentary specimens and found that indeed they could differentiate these specimens from extant Australian fauna. They were able to successfully identify Protymnodon among several other kangaroo genera. So they were able to identify it using its collagen. They could tell Zygomaturus and Palerchestes apart from other large marsupials, but they could not tell them apart from each other.
Okay.
So less resolution, so to speak, with those two, but they were able to identify them as separate from other large marsupials.
Okay.
This also gave them an idea of the timing of extinction for these species. With Zygomaturus and Palerchestes, it looked like they likely went extinct at the late Quaternary period. So around that time, and Protymnodon may have survived long enough to coexist with humans. Bones likely date to about 43,000 years ago. So they said humans who arrived in Tasmania. This has gotten a lot of attention in the articles about it, because this also could weigh in on the debate and questions of the extinction of these megafauna in Australia and megafauna around the world, as to whether or not the timing is coinciding with humans or more likely to have been caused separately by climate change. This new data and potentially studies like it in the future could weigh in on that and refining the timing of extinction rates and whether or not it syncs up with humans for groups like this.
Very cool. It sounds like the start of a methodology that could hopefully be used more widely across the continent. I wonder if more fossil specimens would allow them to collect enough data to find the differences between extinct groups. If they could basically sample all the examples that we have and find the distinctions that would allow them in the future to identify different extinct species from each other.
Yeah, they do mention the fact that you need a reference database to be able to compare the collagens and identify them. And so if that database is lacking or not established for a certain area, that is one of the things that they're hoping this will help spearhead the remedying of.
Yeah, well, and Australia is an interesting spot because so many of the famous megafauna from Australia, you can't build a database from anywhere except Australia.
Yes.
Because those megafaunal marsupials didn't live anywhere else. So it's not like you can say, well, we don't have any data for elephants from South America, but we've got all this data from elephants on other continents, so we can get kind of close. You can't really do that with Australia. With the Australian megafauna, you have to have it from there.
Exactly. So yeah, it's super cool process, and I would be very excited to see more studies like this, just even if it's just testing it out with other groups and seeing what the limits of this technique are.
Yeah. Well, my next bit of news is about the oldest fossil remains of butterflies and moths,
Cool.
which were found in poop. This is research by Lucas Fiorelli et al. In the Journal of South American Earth Sciences, and in the blog post we will link to an article in science.org by Maria de los Angeles Orfila. Lepidoptera is the group of insects that includes butterflies and moths and their extended family. Genetic studies, molecular clock estimates, have predicted that this group originated by the Triassic period. And in fact, early in the Triassic, there is this well-known diversification of many modern insect groups. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. We talked about this a bit in our dragonflies episode 181. In the wake of the end Permian mass extinction, a bunch of modern insect groups got their start, like really radiated and became much more successful. Lepidoptera might have been one of those groups, but the oldest fossils of this group are from the Jurassic, are from the very beginning of the Jurassic. There are fossil scales from around 201 million years ago. The scales are wing scales.
Yes.
So butterflies and moths, one of the things that is distinctive about them is that their wings are covered in these little scales. This is part of what gives them the distinctive patterning and appearance of their wings, as opposed to the transparent wings you often think of with other insects.
And like the dust that you think of coming off of moths, it's these scales getting knocked off when they're grabbed or something.
Yes. So there is this difference between the oldest fossils are tens of millions of years younger than what we suspect the earliest true lepidopterans are. This study identifies significantly older remains.
Ooh.
The oldest known lepidopteran scales, this is more of those wing scales, from a Triassic coprolite. This coprolite comes from the Chañares Formation in Argentina. It is around 236 million years old. In this region, this region is apparently famous for coprolites. Coprolites are fossilized poop. There are lots of sites with, as the paper described them, thousands of coprolites that are attributed to dicynodonts. Dicynodonts were these early mammal cousins, the ones with the little tusks. We've talked about them a bunch of times. These coprolite deposits are thought to most likely be communal latrines. Places where these animals habitually went to this one particular place to poop. Plenty of animals do this today, including lots of herbivores will have a specific area that they go to do their business, because that keeps all of the poop concentrated in one place and you know where not to go.
Yes, and you're not going to eat stuff that's accidentally next to poop.
Yes, exactly. These coprolites, when examined closely, mostly contain plant remains because dicynodonts were plant eaters, but these were relatively large herbivores eating lots of plants, so they also scooped up other stuff from time to time. So in the coprolites, there's also the remains of fungi, there's also insect remains. In one of these coprolites that these researchers studied, they identified 11 fossil scales that appear to be from the wings of Lepidoptera.
Cool.
They identified these as Lepidopteran scales based on both the outer structure and the interior structure of the scales themselves. The scales are, I don't think that they're fully hollow, but there is this internal space within them. But the details of those structures, while matching Lepidoptera broadly, do not match any particular known species. So they actually go all the way and name a new genus and species based on these scales. They named it Ampatiri eloise. The genus name Ampatiri comes from Kakan, the language of the Chalchaki indigenous peoples of the area. The genus is built from the words from that language meaning butterfly and ancient. According to the article, these people, in their worldview, when a warrior dies, the soul becomes a butterfly or journeys on its wings.
Oh, cool.
Which is very cool. And the species name, Eloise, is named for Eloisa Argañares, who was a young doctoral student who co-discovered these coprolites and began studying them, but unfortunately died of brain cancer. before completing this research.
Yeah.
So that is very sad. But now this student has a butterfly, these ancient butterflies bearing their name.
Very cool. That's got to be one of the coolest fossil names just for all of that.
Yes. And that's why I read those. I don't always read the etymology of fossil names because sometimes they're not super exciting, but this one's really cool. Now, I had this thought, and in the science article, I also saw another researcher quoted as this: naming an entirely new genus and species based on just wing scales has the potential to not hold up over time, because these are a very particular part of the body that's not a lot of this animal. But these authors at least feel confident enough in identifying this as a genus and species, and even as identifying it as part of one major subgroup of Lepidoptera.
Okay.
The subgroup Glossata, which today includes all butterflies and most moths. Now that doesn't sound super exciting because it's most of our modern Lepidopterans, but one of the features that characterizes this group is the proboscis.
Okay.
So if this is indeed part of that group, this is also evidence that proboscises among butterflies and moths had evolved at this time.
Yeah. Interesting.
If all of this is correct, these are the oldest Lepidopteran fossils thus far known. They are about 35 million years older than the previous record holder. This puts our earliest Lepidopteran fossils at much earlier in the Triassic, which lines up a little better with those genetic estimates. And if this is accurate, that the proboscis group of Lepidopterans had shown up this early, the authors point out it could be that the evolution of the proboscis was part of what allowed butterflies and moths to become diverse and successful starting around this time.
Yeah. Very cool.
So this is a study of 11 microscopic tiny little scales inside of a poop that has immensely significant implications for our understanding of insect evolution.
Well, it's neat because, yes, naming a species off of such a small amount of the organism is not typically what would be recommended, so to speak. But, many animals have very characteristic features that are just a small bit, like mammals can be named off of a single tooth.
Yes.
And it's 35 million years away from our next known species of butterfly. So the likeliness that it is a species we know feels very, very low. Like,
yeah. Saying that this is a newly discovered species is not, I don't think, remotely controversial.
Yeah.
The only part of this that would be questionable with more detailed analysis might be if the features on these scales are useful enough in identification that you could find them on another fossil and identify it as the same species. That's really where the questioning would come in.
Exactly. Like if we find more butterfly fossils from this age and realize actually the features that we named it off of were common among butterflies at that time.
Right.
It's not what we use to identify it's not actually distinct enough anymore. So we need to reanalyze.
Although if they end up finding a bunch more and then have to synonymize a bunch of names, this name came first.
Yes.
So it's going to have seniority and potentially get adopted for future fossils.
That's my hope.
It is very cool.
It is extremely cool. I also had the thought when you mentioned about like the Dicynodonts eating other things that just came along with the plants. I had initially been wondering if these were butterflies feeding off of the coprolites and leaving behind scales.
Oh, sure.
Because today moths and butterflies will feed on dung to get like phosphates and things that are found much more readily from animals, but they're not able to be carnivorous. So instead they just feed off of urine and dung and things like that have those waste materials in them.
Yeah. Well, you can imagine, especially if this is a communal latrine, that you're a butterfly that has flown down to this wonderful smorgasbord, and while you're feeding on it,
Yep.
another Dicytodon comes along. Now, I think the most dramatic image here is that there was a butterfly hanging out on a leaf and it got eaten.
Yes.
It's also entirely possible that this was like a dead butterfly that was laying on a plant or in a bunch of leaf litter or something and got scooped up, which would explain why it got caught in the mouth of a large and presumably slow herbivore.
Yeah. Well, and that's why when you said that was their interpretation, because when I was wondering it, I'm like, if the scales are on the outside of the coprolite, then those could just be shed while butterflies are flapping around them. If they're in it, then yeah, that got eaten somehow. You at least ate a wing.
It could also have been shed onto a leaf that then got eaten. Now, to be fair, I don't think I saw in their description that they specifically interpreted this animal ate a butterfly.
Yeah.
But just to point out that coprolites of herbivorous animals often end up with other stuff in them. I don't think they are specifically interpreting how these scales ended up in there. So any of these is a perfectly viable
I personally
option.
love the dung feeding butterflies, because there's nothing that is one of my favorite images in nature, is a pile of stinky gross dung with beautiful butterflies flitting around it like fairies.
There are also today butterflies that feed on carcasses.
Yes.
That will go after the gooey fluids in a dead animal. So you also, and some of them are beautiful, like these beautiful purple and red butterflies that hang around dead stuff.
Yeah, it's the morbid and beautiful are hand in hand in nature, and it's great. My next news is still in the Triassic. This is research on archosaur evolution using ancient maps to interpret how they must have been moving and dispersing.
Oh, maps left behind by archosaur cartographers.
Yes, he's just out from a dusty shelf. Blow the dust. This is research by Joseph Flannery Sutherland et al. In Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and the article is a press release by sci.news. This research is addressing a issue that often comes up, much like we were talking about the fragmentary fossils. Another issue we have in the fossil record is gaps in fossil records, where we'll be studying a location or a group, and you've got a fossil record that's going great, no fossils for them for however millions of years, and then they show back up. We know that those animals were still around during that time, but we can't see what they were doing. This makes it difficult to track, evolutionary rates and dispersal patterns and, all sorts of other things about the group, when certain features evolved or when certain species evolved. This study is using a technique that is aiming to kind of circumvent those gaps by looking at what we do have and overlaying it with the geographical data we have of the areas those fossils were found. This technique uses reconstructions of the ancient maps that would have been the landscape those animals were living in, and the fossils we do have, along with their evolutionary data we have, and interpreting how must they have been moving to have gotten where they are from what we do have. So that way we can say, we don't know exactly what you were doing in this gap, but from this point to this, the 2 points we have on either side of the gap, you moved from here to here. So we know that movement had to happen somewhere during that gap. We can't see there, but we know it happened. And using this overlaying, they can kind of get around the gaps and at least learn about the dispersal patterns of these groups. This method they called TARDIS because they are looking at terrains and routes directed in space-time. So TARDIS.
Yep. And paleontologists are huge nerds, as we have often discussed. Listen, sometimes we come up with a thing and we name it lovingly in memory of a researcher who did work and in honor of the indigenous communities that live in an area. And other times we name it after silly sci-fi fantasy pop culture stuff.
I'd do a TARDIS noise if I knew how to, that weird noise it makes. They are using it here to reconstruct the dispersal patterns of archosauromorphs across the Permian and Triassic. Archosaurs, as we will be discussing this episode quite heavily, is the dinosaur and croc group of reptiles, and the archosauromorphs are the early members of that group before we got our dinosaur and crocs. With the data they are looking at, they were able to kind of reconstruct a dispersal pattern for the first 20 million years of archosaur evolution and found notable ecogeographic diversity, so finding them in multiple habitats. It sounds like there was a peak in what they called climatic disparity in the earliest Triassic period, so differences in the climates that they were finding them at. And they found that there must have been dispersals through the Pangaean tropical areas, which previously had been interpreted as likely dead zones.
Yeah.
These were the effectively super deserts that have been interpreted in the central areas of equatorial Pangaea.
Yeah, this came up in the news not too long ago with fossils of amphibians from the central region of Pangaea, with researchers going, cool, we didn't think anything was living here.
Yes.
Or at least we weren't sure that anything was living here.
Exactly. This is showing that archosaurs were also traversing these areas, and they even noted that there had to have been migrations of up to 16,000 kilometers or 10,000 miles, that some of these dispersals were covering some notable distances, and whether or not they were actual migrations or over time dispersal, but that these were movements of these species across large areas and areas that we didn't think they would have been able to be dispersing across. This is important for reinterpreting how we look at the paleogeography of Pangaea during this time. And they note that if they are making it across these harsh environments, that could likely be a big reason why they were so successful going forward, that they were hardy and resilient and able to adapt to tough and diverse habitat situations.
Yeah, it's interesting because it makes me wonder how much of that ability to move across the continent, how much of it was their adaptations to survive harsh conditions, and how much of it was their ability to find the habitable area.
Yes.
Yep. Like, was there a band across the continent where, like, it was extra rainy or something, and that helped make it a little bit more hospitable? Were there these patches that they could thrive in?
Yeah, and that was my other thought, is that this also could be telling us that that dead zone wasn't as harsh as we thought it was, and that actually there were quite a number of quite habitable habitats across that area, so life was able to hopscotch across it quite effectively.
Yeah. Well, and the more life that we find that was able to move into and through those areas, that provides more opportunities for yet more life. Like, if there were amphibians that were able to survive out there, then yeah, archosaurs could go up there and eat those amphibians.
Yep, that means there was water there and prey there.
Yes, exactly. So, very cool.
Absolutely.
This episode's bunch of news has been a fun set of news, because we started with an exceptionally well-preserved fossil that taught us things we could never have learned before. And then the other three newses were all, what can we do with extremely limited fossil remains?
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So we're getting both sides of the spectrum.
What if we have fragments? What if we just have a little itty bitty piece? What if we don't have fossils?
Well, yes, exactly.
Oh, well, that wraps up the news. And speaking of archosaurs, we can move into our main discussion of terrestrial crocs. After the break, we'll start by asking the question of how terrestrial are our crocs today? So to start our discussion of terrestrial crocs, I figure it is best to start with the crocs we know best, which is our modern crocodilians.
Yes, which are mostly not terrestrial.
Yes. Today, every living member of Crocodilia or Crocodiliforms that we have alive today are semi-aquatic. So good in the water, can come out on land. That classic in between being a land animal and a fully aquatic animal, semi-aquatic. This is true for every member solidly. They are all definitely semi aquatic ambush predators. There are some that are often heralded as being more or less semi aquatic, more or less terrestrial or aquatic among the
Yes.
overall group.
Yeah, every crocodilian species today can swim well and can walk quite well.
Yes,
And then there's variation in how well they do those things.
exactly. Like famously, the gharial has often been noted as the least terrestrial.
Yes. And that was the one when I was saying can walk quite well. That was the
Yes.
little thing in my head. It was like, except for some gharials. But if I remember you explaining this before, that's particularly for the larger individuals.
Yeah. From what I've heard, and this is one of those where I don't know if this has been confirmed in a study, but famously it is noted that adult gharials seem to either not be willing to do or can no longer do the high walk, which is when they stand up to walk off the belly. So they can really only belly crawl when they're out of the water. But they are also considered the most aquatic, the most water bound of the crocodilians today. There are a handful that will get noted for being more terrestrial, and depending on what source you look at, different species will get pointed at as the most terrestrial modern croc. The African dwarf crocodile is often cited as being more terrestrial, foraging and actually finding food on land.
Okay, interesting.
Typically at night and like during rains is when I've seen it quoted. The smooth-fronted caiman, also sometimes described as semi-terrestrial.
Interesting. Okay.
The freshwater crocodile is famous for fleeing via a gallop, for running away from danger with that gallop that they are extremely well known for, and for a while were thought to be the only ones that could do this. But we now know it is more common, which we'll get to in just a moment. The Cuban crocodile is often pointed at as the most terrestrial. They do the gallop. They also will do it aggressively. They will run toward things like
Yeah, they'll
keepers
do
and
like a charge, like a bluff
yes.
charge. Well, a bluff if you are smart and you get out of the way.
Exactly.
Like, they'll do a bluff charge the way that like a lot of like a bear will do.
Yes.
That they're not just using it to run away, they're also using it as a defensive scare tactic.
Yeah, this is one of those where I don't know how it compares to their wild behavior, but there are tons of videos of keepers being chased around the enclosure by a galloping Cuban crocodile. So they are quite good on land. They have long limbs proportionate to their body. And I've seen it noted that they have reduced webbing on the back feet and seen it said that they might have no webbing on the front. But I haven't been able to find like an anatomical official description. So I don't know if this is just something that has been noted by people who get close to them.
Yeah, it's an interesting little way to drive home the point that for the most part, being good at moving on land and being good at moving in the water are competing skills.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you're going to make one better, you're often going to end up making the other one worse.
Yeah, they are fundamentally different environments to move in. And unless you're moving like a snake where your motion is pretty similar,
where you're already perfect, where the whole body shape and locomotion all nailed it. No need to change anything.
Three votes from being perfect. And, but there is this competing selective pressures. Now, some people might now be going, you've mentioned galloping twice, and that might be new information for a lot of people that yes. Crocodilians can gallop. They are actually quite good at moving around on land. They're not as graceful as most land animals, but they are not clumsy on land. Crocodilians have numerous modes of moving around on land. Famously, the two that you will see quoted most often are the low walk or crawl and the high walk. So low rock is walking like a lizard or a salamander. Your legs are out to the side, kind of bent at right angles, and you're walking them, swinging them side to side as you're walking forward.
Right. And especially in bigger crocs, you're dragging the body along the ground or very close to the ground.
Yes, you'll hear that called the belly slide, where they literally are just laying on the ground and then shifting themselves forward on with their limbs. This is often what you'll see how they go back into the water, where they just find a slope, get on their belly, and just push a little bit and slide into the water.
Yes.
The high walk is their efficient land movement. They raise up on the legs, not quite with the limbs fully under the body like us mammals, but much closer to that stance than your typical reptile stance. And this is you'll hear it called semi-erect posture.
Mhm.
They bring the legs under, raise up, and now they can travel longer distances much more efficiently and quickly. This is to move from one body of water to another, to cross stretches of lands when your pond has dried up and you need to find new water, things like that.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned, being able to flee on land from, dangers in the water. Also, crocs tend to nest on land.
Yes, exactly.
So there's a lot of good reasons to be able to move around efficiently out of the water.
Yeah, they are still inherently tied to the land, so they are quite adept at it. These both are walking with alternating the front right and the back left foot move forward, and then the back right and the front left move forward. It's diagonal limb movement, but crocs can employ other gaits, other forms of movement, and in fact, they can employ almost the full range of movements we see in mammals.
Oh, cool.
They can do faster versions of those normal of the high walk that can go into a trot, which is what we typically think when you see an alligator running, is really quickly but still that same pattern of movement. That would be a trot. They have asymmetrical gaits that they use. They can gallop, as mentioned beforehand, and bound. And if you go to our hopping episode, we go over bounding.
Episode 193.
So this is when you land with the front limbs, and then as you land with the back feet, you get ready to hop off again to land again on the front feet. And so your front limbs and your back limbs are moving in sync as a front pair and back pair. And it's how bunnies move around. If you picture a bunny moving that way, that's how crocs move their fastest, is with a full bound. They can also half bound where they're not quite in sync. And then their gallops are kind of in between, where it's a little bit, out of sync bounding, but also kind of a similar pattern to their trotting. And so they have this gradient that they can move, each gait being faster and faster, trot to gallop to half bound to full bound. They also can utilize different gallops, rotary gallops and transverse gallops, which are more useful for different things. I saw one note that rotary gallops are a little bit more maneuverable, and transverse galloping is a little bit more stable. We see those gallopings in mammals, but they're typically differentiated by the size of the mammal, where transverse gallops are for slower, large animals, good for endurance running, and rotary galloping is for smaller, sprinting animals. So crocodilians show a bunch of the same ways of moving as mammals. They're not as fast, and they're probably not as energy efficient as a lot of the mammals that are doing those movements, but they can do basically all those same movements, and they can shift from one to the other. I saw one noting that they can go from a fast high walk gradually into a gallop, and then from a gallop gradually into a bounding. So you can see this transition where they can start moving, need to move faster. Now I really need to go.
Yeah, well, it's like videos or diagrams of horses going from one gate to the next gate.
So though they are not terrestrial, none of our crocodilians today are terrestrial animals, they are surprisingly efficient on land and can move when need to. No, you don't need to run away from them in zigzag, even though we just went over how fast they can move. They're not usually chasing anyone with these.
No, absolutely not. Climb a tree.
Yes.
Although, and I was going to say, they also can climb.
Yes. Yes.
They're not excellent climbers, and that's not really what the discussion is about. But in the realm of moving around on land, they can climb trees, they can climb fences. They are pretty good at moving around over solid substrate.
Yeah, it's very much like turtles, where turtles can actually climb a lot better than you'd think they could. And no, they're not graceful about it. They're not moving like a squirrel. But if you need to get from A to B, you can do a lot more than you might seem like with the body you have, because it's survival. You need to get over this wall. You need to get up that hill. So they're going to.
I remember being at a zoo, I think, once and watching a Galapagos tortoise try to climb out of its enclosure. It was not successful, but it was doing a better job than I expected it to do.
Yeah, exactly. One fun note is that like I said, this galloping and bounding used to be known from the freshwater crocodiles, the Australian freshwater croc, and then was noted that it was actually present in other juveniles of crocodiles. And now we know that it's actually found in most crocodiles, at least the ones that were studied. I think there were some that weren't studied that we just haven't yet noted it in, but very likely can do it. The study that did this, the only exception they found was that alligators seem to either be unwilling or incapable, even though muscular-wise, it doesn't seem like they should be. It seems like they should be able to do it. They just never did. They would only high walk run.
Interesting. Which tracks.
Yes.
That feels very alligator. That they're like,
Absolutely.
I could run, but I'm not gonna.
Yes, same
I'm not
alligators.
Incentivized.
Same.
Yes, absolutely.
Though I did find one that noted that they didn't differ in maximum speeds, that they were able to achieve some pretty high speeds without bounding. So they were still getting around, they just weren't moving the same way as other crocodiles at their top speed.
All right.
Yeah. This is an interesting note, and we'll get into this more a bit later, but this means that these terrestrial movements, as we will note later, terrestriality seems like it is most likely ancestral to the overall crocodilomorph group.
Yeah, they started on land.
They started on land. That could mean that these forms of motion are from their ancestors. These ways of moving on land might be some of the same ways that their ancestors were moving that have been retained. That's hard to determine. These could be evolved secondarily after this group became semi-aquatic, that they then found their own ways of moving on land. But this form of movement in this group could be something that goes back to their ancestral state. If not, then it means that these forms of, especially the asymmetrical gaits, the galloping and bounding, would have had to evolve in crocodilia and then be lost in alligatoridae, instead of just being ancestral to everyone and only lost in alligators. So, talking about actually terrestrial crocodiles, like fully living on land or living a majority of their life on land, because everything's a gradient in nature. You can be mostly terrestrial, sometimes aquatic. Like there's tons.
I can swim.
Exactly, yeah.
If I need to get across a river, I could do it.
There's tons of animals that, it makes me think of like bears, where it's like, yeah, that's a land animal, except when the salmon are running, and then they're spending a chunk of their time in the water.
Yeah, except when it needs to find a new ice flow.
Yeah, exactly. But for crocs that spend a majority of time on land, there are some common features and anatomical peculiarities that we tend to see that identify them as terrestrial crocs. Because, as just mentioned, we don't have any modern ones. So all terrestrial crocs are fossil crocs. Every example we have is an extinct species of some sort. So we have to identify these terrestrial traits when we look at them.
Yes. And I guess that is actually a good point to make, is that, as we mentioned, our crocs today are all semi-aquatic and they kind of vary on the spectrum. In the fossil record, the greater crocodilomorph group varies from all the way fully terrestrial to all the way fully marine,
Absolutely.
fully aquatic.
Yes.
And both of those have happened multiple times. So
Yes.
when we look across the fossil record, we actually see several instances of crocs being terrestrial species, which is what the episode is about. If you want the other side of the spectrum, episode 168, that we already did that one.
Yes, so we will not be mentioning their marine cousins this episode, at least not much. There are some key features that we tend to see that lean us toward interpreting a fossil croc as likely terrestrial. The most common ones are features of the skull.
Mhm.
Part of this is because we see very different shaped skulls for land crocs and semi-aquatic crocs, but also because croc skulls preserve very well because they are tough and they stay together. So a lot of the croc fossil record is based off of skulls. When we look at a croc skull, today all crocs have relatively flat heads and long, wide snouts. You know, you have varying degrees. You have skinny snouts, but like by and large, the most common, if you think of like a Nile crocodile or an American alligator, flat head, long snout, wide snout. We call this shape platyrostral. Like think of platypus, platyrostral. You've got kind of a duck face.
Platy means flat.
Yes, exactly. This is a good shape to be if you are peeking your eyes, nose, and ears out of the water without exposing the rest of your face. So it is a good shape to be for an ambush predator attacking from shallow water.
It's also a really good shape for the kind of sideways movement that crocs make to grab at their food. It's good at moving in the water and also out of the water.
Absolutely. On land, though, if you're not needing to hide in water, there's no reason to be flat. And though crocs have very strong skulls and very strong bites, that is a very unusual shape to have a very strong bite with. They have very specialized features to give them such a strong bite, being such a flat face. It's much more structurally sound if you build your face tall-wise so that the stresses can be supported better. Think of like T-Rex's face, where you're taller than you are wide. That's what we tend to see in terrestrial crocs. We call this altarostral.
Alti meaning high.
Yes, taller than it is wide. If you think of most predatory dinosaur faces and stuff, that kind of shape. Even terrestrial predators and in mammals with like wolves and stuff, where your bite is not needing to be, your face is not needing to be flat because you're not hiding it in water. So now you can just focus on it being an efficient biting structure. We also tend to see differences in the dentition, their teeth. Today's crocs mostly have simple cones as their teeth, good for grabbing stuff, not much else. Terrestrial crocodiles tend to have zyphodont teeth, which means serrated teeth that are compressed side to side like a steak knife. So,
Yes.
once again, very common among terrestrial predators. Lots of predatory dinosaurs had teeth like this. Modern day monitor lizards have teeth like this. This is what we tend to see in terrestrial crocs. Now, neither of these are exclusive to terrestrial crocs. There are examples. Dacosuchus, which is a marine croc, fully marine. This one had paddle-like limbs, has a tall head, a tall skull, and zyphodont serrated teeth.
I assume for hunting on like sandbars.
Right?
Just
Yeah,
like
exactly.
jumping over a sandbar and grabbing at stuff like a land predator and then falling back in.
Yeah, so like there's no reason one shape of skull can't be useful in another environment, but typically when we see these features, we tend to see them in crocs that have other evidences that they were living on land, not semi-aquatic. There are, of course, other evidence that we look for. Most obviously, probably, is if they've got legs that look like they were made for walking around. Long legs, slender legs, less squat, more straight limbed, because today's crocodilians have more curved limb bones because they're squatty and they're not needing to support the weight as often.
Yeah, a lot of terrestrial, like if you think about mammals and dinosaurs, we have limbs that are shaped more like pillars to
Yes.
fully support the weight of the body.
And so, if the hips and shoulder girdle look like they were made for standing upright, all of those evidences, if the stance looks like it was made more for standing upright, that is evidence of a terrestrial croc. I also saw, though, that this also is not always a guaranteed, because they noted that this may be only a croc thing, because in lots of mammals, we see examples of erect postured animals that are semi-aquatic, like water buffaloes, tapirs, and hippopotamus.
Sure. Yeah, that makes
So,
sense.
these crocs could be living like one of those and could be spending a vast majority of their time in the water, but are just good walkers. So we look for other evidence on top of these obvious physical ones to see if they might be terrestrial. One is the internal anatomy of their skull. So not the shape of the skull, but the internal structures in how pneumatized the skull is, which is how much open space there is inside your skull. If we see lots of expanded spaces, this tends to go along with a life on land, while less of that tends to go with semi-aquatic and aquatic, which likely has to do with the fact that diving puts pressure on those air spaces, so you don't want large air spaces in your skull. This also could be a fact that the shape of skulls that we see in a lot of aquatic crocs wouldn't allow for as much open spaces.
Right. It's that flat head.
A lot of aquatic crocs have long, slender snouts and that flat head that you also just might have a reduction due to that. But either way, whether it's the fact that you have space in a terrestrial skull or not as much pressure to reduce those spaces, we tend to see more open spaces in a land croc's skull. And then there's things like geochemistry. If we look at the isotopes that are found in the bones or teeth of an animal, we can often tell what kind of foods and environments they were living in, so we can get those indications of whether they were getting more terrestrial diet or aquatic diet. And so very often we will look for multiple of these, as many of these as we can, to try to confirm a terrestrial lifestyle, because even if it's shaped like an animal that we think would be best on land, it might be still spending a ton of time in the water. It might be a great swimmer, surprisingly, like the polar bear, where does not look like it should be as good as it is, but it does great.
Yeah. It can also be helpful, the environment, the depositional environment you find a fossil in. If
Absolutely.
you find it, right? This is especially useful for like marine animals. Right. Well, we
Mm-hmm.
found it in the ocean, and that is extremely helpful. We found it in ocean sediments. Same thing can happen for terrestrial animals, where you find it in more continental, like terrestrial center of a continent environments.
Yeah, if it's found in a desert, that's a pretty good indicator that it probably wasn't swimming super regularly.
Yes.
There are some others that I found that seem to be not as commonly used, but they do come up. Trackways can be a
Sure.
useful tool. If we have tracks that are thought to likely be from crocodilian ancestors, then and if we can match it to likely candidates who made them, we can see, does the anatomy of this croc fit the tracks we're seeing? And does that seem to be a terrestrial type of locomotion that we're indicating? This was done for at least a couple of groups that I found. Batrachotomus, which is a pseudotsuchian, so distant ancestor and cousin of crocodilians, but terrestrial croc-like animal from the Triassic. They modeled its limbs and predicted what efficient gaits would most likely be used by this animal, and then took those gaits and see if any of them matched to trackways that likely came from this animal or an animal like it, and found that those gaits matched its slower paces that they predicted. So doing things like that to try to confirm, we predict a terrestrial locomotion like this, and that does match footprints we've found, can be a route. But it seems like this might be one of the only examples where this has been done. But that is another thing we can look for. And then one that I found interesting, because I had never heard this mentioned, is osteoderms. There seems to be typically differences in osteoderms between terrestrial and aquatic.
I was wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the bony armor that crocs have covering their back and sometimes other portions of their body, like around the belly and some caimans. In semi-aquatic crocs, these are important for defense, but also for thermoregulation. It helps them absorb heat from the sun more efficiently because there's lots of blood vessels intertwining in those bony armor pieces. So that makes them much more efficient at gaining that heat. And in terrestrial crocs, we tend to see a reduction in osteoderms, not a lack of osteoderms typically. There is at least one group I saw mentioned as lacking osteoderms, but typically the only crocodilians that we know of that, or crocodilomorphs that we know of that lack osteoderms are the marine metriorhynchids, which are the dolphin crocs. But with terrestrial crocs, there is a reduction in it, and this could be a lack of need of that efficient thermoregulation because you're no longer in cold water. Now the water's not pulling your heat from you like it is for an alligator. You're in the air. So you're going to heat up much more like a typical land reptile.
Yeah. I was wondering about osteoderms because you mentioned that skulls are extremely common. Animals that have osteoderms tend to leave behind lots of osteoderms in the fossil record.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes,
so
they do.
crocodilian osteoderms are also common in the fossil record. And there are some animals, like some groups of lizards, where osteoderms are often the go-to identifiers
Yes.
because they're so common among fossils. So I'm not at all surprised that people have noted potential differences in osteoderms between different lifestyles of crocs.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, there's still plenty of quite armored terrestrial crocs, but the features of the osteoderm sometimes differ, and sometimes just a lack of a notable reduction in the amount of osteoderms or thickness of osteoderms, things like that,
Mhm.
tend to be more common for terrestrial crocs. This also could have to do with structural stuff. Osteoderms do act as a structural support system with the connection of all the they're not connected together as in a fused bone plate, but tissue connects them, and they do end up acting kind of like a suspension bridge on the back of
Mhm.
a alligator or crocodile when they're walking. If you are a terrestrial croc with posture more suited for walking on land, you might not need that extra support as much.
Right. I also imagine that especially if it's losing some of its essential function for being on land, it's also just extra bulk and weight if
Yeah,
you need to be moving around quickly or efficiently on land. If you don't need it, then absolutely it's something you could easily get rid of.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if it increases your flexibility to get rid of it or something,
Hmm.
then now if you're a quick little land animal, because some of these land crocs were quite small,
No.
it could be useful to get rid of it. When we look at ancient extinct crocs, we see a huge amount of diversity. They lived in all sorts of different environments and also had different feeding habits. Another thing that will sometimes be pointed out as, "Ooh, does this mean you're terrestrial?" is when we see teeth that are meant for something other than carnivory. When we see specialized teeth, we tend to lean toward thinking, does that, were you living on land? Because 99% of our semi-aquatic crocs that we know of, both modern and fossil record, tend to have very similar teeth setups. So when you see heterodont, crocs with teeth that are different in different parts of the mouth, that tends to lean us toward thinking maybe you are doing something on land.
Yes, especially if you have something that seems somewhat adapted for plant eating. Yeah,
Yep.
heterodont teeth are really good for like omnivorous diets, eating a little bit
Yes.
of both. And then there's some teeth are specialized for grinding up plants. If we start to see any sort of specialization for taking in some plant matter, you tend not to get herbivory is a thing that you tend to do on land.
Yes.
If you're looking for plants, on land is the place to find them.
And for anyone who might now be thinking, yeah, but what about hippopotamus? They graze on land.
Yeah, they go out of the water to eat. Same thing with tapirs.
Yeah, manatees are really one of the only aquatic, fully aquatic, herbivorous like mammals that I can think of.
Yes, I guess marine iguanas.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
they're scraping like algae and stuff,
Yeah.
but they are also collecting it underwater.
Yeah. So it could be happening. That's why I said this is not a guarantee that these animals are terrestrial, but if we find a fossil croc and you've got weird teeth, the question comes up of, were you terrestrial?
Right. Start looking for other signs of terrestriality.
Exactly. And a lot of times we have to do that because many times all you find is the skull.
Mhm.
So we don't know what the body was shaped like. We don't know how long the limbs were. We don't know how erect the posture would have been. We don't know what the hips were doing. So we have to go off of this. And that's why there's a lot that are suspected of terrestriality, but not able to be confirmed terrestrial crocs. And a lot of the ones that get mentioned today fall into that category. And I have seen multiple implications of this is a terrestrial croc, and other people going, oh, it was probably more of just a croc. It's probably more
Mhm.
semi-aquatic. It is hard to tell with some of these. When we look at the earliest ancestors of crocodilomorphs, we find that they are terrestrial. As we already mentioned, the Suchia side of archosaurs. So archosaurs are the big group of reptiles that includes dinosaurs and pterosaurs on one side. On the other side is the Suchia side of reptiles, the croc-shaped side of reptiles. This group starts out on land in the Triassic. The famous early members of this group are the Pseudosuchia, the false crocodiles, the not quite crocodiles. They are, many of them, dominant land animals during the Triassic. We're not going to go into detail into Pseudosuchia. That is a different episode. We're going to focus on the actual croc side, the croc members, crocodilomorph and down of this side of Archosauria. But Pseudosuchia is where you get things like the Rauisuchians, which were big land predators, some of them 20 feet long. You know, things like Postosuchus are famous members in this group. You also get the Adasaurs, which were large-bodied, armored herbivores that were moving around on land, like an ankylosaur, but were closer related to crocs than dinosaurs. None of these members survive the Triassic. They all go extinct at the end of the Triassic. Only crocodilomorphs make it through the Triassic, and they become the rest of the Suchia side of things until today.
Yeah, the croc lineage, like the croc family tree, starts out with a bunch of terrestrial near crocs. Like they are
Mm-hmm.
land animals very commonly. When their heyday comes to an end, what we're left with is crocodilomorpha on the road to truer crocs. And
Yes.
terrestriality becomes less of the default for the next 200 million years in the way that it was before.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, they actually still, like, our earliest crocodilomorphs were still terrestrial moving into
Hmm.
the Jurassic. So there were terrestrial crocodilomorphs during the Triassic. You know, they were doing quite well. There were hypercarnivore members of them. At the end Triassic, we see all of the hypercarnivores die, and terrestrial generalists make it through into the Jurassic. And they then diversify like crazy. And in fact, some of them become incredibly successful as terrestrial crocs during the Cretaceous. So there were
Cool.
semi-aquatic crocodilomorphs during the Jurassic and Cretaceous, but there were also extremely numerous terrestrial groups doing very, very well during those times.
Cool. So they were doing more of their diversity like their ancestors, like the
Yes,
Pseudosuchians back in the Triassic.
exactly.
Very
They
cool.
never were able to get the same dominance that the Pseudosuchians had, because now there were theropod dinosaurs occupying the roles as dominant predators on land. But there were definitely environments where some of your larger predators would have been croc cousins running around on land. On the note of them becoming true crocs, just to give you an idea of what the kind of pattern is, crocodilomorphs start out as terrestrial, and early interpretations held that there was one shift in the early Jurassic from terrestrial to semi aquatic, and that was the line that led to modern crocs. It now seems more likely that there were multiple shifts, at least three independent shifts from terrestrial to aquatic, one being the one that would lead to Neosuchians, our modern day crocodilians, and one in the Notosuchians, who we'll talk about after the break. There is also one that we'll talk about toward the end of the episode, transition from a semi-aquatic Neosuchian back to terrestrial. So at least two examples of shifting from semi-aquatic back to terrestrial. So we have at least two groups that seem to have done that And then there are, of course, many shifts from semi-aquatic to marine and marine back to freshwater and stuff. Those we talked about in our marine crocs episode. But that gives you kind of an idea that terrestriality was the default, both ancestrally and for much of the Mesozoic. Certain groups transitioned to semi-aquatic, and then they became very successful and ended up making it to modern day. But that was not the given norm until fairly recently, as far as the crocodilian fossil record goes.
Yeah, we've really, as we were sort of mentioning before, we've really narrowed the range of what crocs do in our modern world. They're a pretty narrow spectrum of lifestyles compared to the Mesozoic.
Exactly. So some of the earliest members of Crocodilomorpha that show terrestrial habits and are notable is the Sphenosuchians. This is the sister group to Crocodiliforms. So we're in Crocodilomorpha. Crocodiliforms is one step closer to our modern day crocs. These are the sister group to them. They were doing quite well. They were found across much of the southern and northern hemispheres around the equator, known from the Triassic and into the Jurassic. So this is one of those groups that survived across that end extinction. They show a lot of the same features you'd expect: the tall skull, the long limbs, serrated teeth. They were not, during the Triassic, some of those apex predators, and in fact, we see some that show teeth that lean more toward omnivory, and a Coelophysis that has gut content of one of these Sphenosuchians that it ate. So they do not seem like they were the big predators, but there do seem to be some after the Rausuchians died out and theropods started coming in that could have been trying to fill that niche. Carnifex and Redondavinator, which were fairly large sized, so could have been potential contenders after the loss of the Pseudosuchian big predators. We also have Protosuchians, which are very early crocodiliforms. So they seem to be real close to either early crocodiliforms or very just outside of that group. These also show your typical land features, but one that they noted was some of them show restricted neck flexibility, which is just interesting to this group. Some of them having notable osteoderms on the neck and specialized neck bones and neck ribs, which could be a defensive mechanism of some sort. And in here, we do see them with a diverse form of diets, some of them being herbivorous, like Edentosukis, others being definitely carnivorous, but some were even noted to be potentially insectivorous. Gubiosuchids have sharp pointed teeth, so very much like your typical insect-eating mammals. But most of these were not large-bodied terrestrial crocs. The early crocodilomorphs that, many of them that made it into the Jurassic, were not yet the large-bodied predators that are famous in some other groups. Those we find in the crocodiliforms, which we will talk about after the break and go into some of the most famous terrestrial crocs and notable groups that really did extremely well on land. When talking about terrestrial crocodiles or crocodiliforms, there's one group that stands above the rest as the group of terrestrial crocs, and that is the Notosuchians.
Yes, even I knew that.
Yeah. Most times, if someone talks about a cool example of a croc running around on land, usually, if you have to just give a general group they fell into, it's Notosuchians. This group evolved in the Middle Jurassic and continued until the Miocene.
Mm-hmm.
They have been around for a very long time.
Yeah, so they were around for like 150 million years.
Yeah.
just kicking butt.
That also means that they are one of the few groups to just go across the end Cretaceous and survive the end of the Mesozoic.
Yes, we've mentioned briefly a few times, including in episode 196, the Madsoid snakes,
Hmm.
which are a
Hmm.
very similar situation where they showed up in the Cretaceous and then they were around almost to today. That you
Yes.
have these both in crocs and snakes, you have these major groups that lived with the dinosaurs and then almost overlapped with us.
Yep.
And
They
Madsoids did
were.
overlap with us, just not even more so than the
Yes.
Notosuchians did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Notosuchians don't quite make it to humans. We do have terrestrial crocs that overlapped with humans, but
Yes.
that different group. Different group that we'll get into after the Notosuchians. This group was very successful, particularly during the Cretaceous. We see their peak in diversity during the Cretaceous with over 70 different known fossil species. They were found throughout Gondwana. That's particularly where they were most abundant. There are ones known from outside the southern continents, but places like South America are famous for Notosuchian diversity. They included the range of body types that we tend to see in terrestrial crocs: small bodied little animals that likely were eating insect and small animals, large bodied predators, and herbivores and omnivores all are represented among Notosuchians. Not only did they survive the end Cretaceous, it makes them one of only three groups of crocodile that did so, one being the one that led to our modern ones. They also, based off the fossils that we find after the Cretaceous Notosuchians, which seem to be relatively large bodied, either they gained large size shortly after the extinction, or they are a very, very rare example of large bodied animals that survived the extinction, which for most other groups just didn't happen. This group is mostly terrestrial. There are some semi-aquatic members that seem to have evolved semi-aquatic behavior, semi-aquatic lifestyles from terrestrial ancestors. Some of these are like questioned. I've seen both represented as a terrestrial or semi-aquatic croc, so some of these are not as clear. One big question and fun thing that comes up with Notosuchians, that if you Google them, you'll often see discussion of, is whether or not they were warm-blooded,
Oh
because
yeah.
these are active terrestrial animals, often quite large-bodied. Some of these are very often over 10 feet long, so not small animals. Were these warm-blooded animals? Part of this question is that based off of our evidence and understanding of their ancestors, the Pseudosuchians, we consider typically that the Pseudosuchians were likely some form of endothermic, some form of warm-blooded.
Yeah. Also, these Notosuchians are living as terrestrial predators and omnivores in the same habitats as dinosaurs. We're doing
Yes.
the same sort of things. And dinosaurs are generally considered to have been varying degrees of warm blooded.
Absolutely. So there's tons of reasons that it would make sense for Notosuchians to be some form of endothermic. Studies that have looked into this, though, seem to consistently find that they were ectothermic, cold-blooded, or at
Okay.
least some form of cold-blooded.
Sure. More cold blooded.
Exactly. One set of research that looked at their estimates for their metabolic rates based off of different features of different types of bone that tend to show different ratios for different kinds of metabolism, and blood cell dimensions inferred from canal diameter, to which would give an idea of how much blood flow you could have and what the size of the blood cells were, which also pertains to metabolism. They found that Notosuchia was notably lower in its metabolic rate than mammal levels and closer, to your typical reptile levels, but they fell out between modern crocs and modern monitor lizards, which are notably among today's reptiles our most high octane reptiles. Monitor lizards are quite high energy and active land predators. So,
Right. So on the warmer end of what we typically consider cold blooded animals.
yes. And which means that many of them may have been maintaining their heat in a similar way to like a Komodo dragon. another
Yeah.
large-bodied land predator that does have to get its heat from the sun, but is doing it differently than a tiny little lizard or a turtle would.
Yes, and a lot of the features of terrestrial crocodiliforms overlap with things like big monitor lizards today. The way that
Yes,
they move, the way
absolutely.
that their skull and teeth are shaped. So it wouldn't be a surprise if they were living a similar lifestyle with a similar physiology.
Absolutely. Another thing they noted is that for some of the bigger members, you also get what's called thermal inertia, which we've talked about before with like the leatherback sea turtle and animals like that. That once you get to a certain size, it's hard to cool down that much body. It's hard to warm it up, but if it is able to be warmed, it's much harder to cool it down. And just through like muscle movement, you will generate heat inside a body that large. So for some of the bigger members, they might have had the aid of thermal inertia.
Right. This is sometimes called gigantothermy. The idea
Yes,
that your body is maintained at a higher body temperature simply by just how much body you have.
absolutely. Some notable groups. This is the group we will be talking about most of this second half. And so if at any point you're wondering, like, why haven't you gotten to this group yet? It's probably because they are a Notosuchian and we just haven't
Yep.
gotten to them yet. Like, most of the famous groups fall into Notosuchia. One notable group is the Uruguay Suchidae, which are mostly small-bodied members that fall during the that show up during the Cretaceous and are found in Africa and South America. Typically, these are less than 2 meters long, so less than 6 feet, fairly small. Some of them being quite small, like 3 feet long at max, probably. They're also notable for having short, kind of mammal-looking snouts, like
Mhm.
fairly short and very like profile wise on many of these look like little dog skulls. They don't look, they have wrong holes and the shape isn't quite right, but general profile, very mammalian looking faces. There are some famous members here that some people might have heard of because there was a whole documentary about some of these crocs when they were discovered alongside Caprosuchus and Sarcosuchus.
Mhm.
Areopasuchus is a genus that has multiple members that have different nicknames. Some of them, Areopasuchus ratoides is rat croc, who small little croc has protruding lower teeth, kind of like rodent incisors.
Yeah.
Areopasuchus wagneri is dog croc, which has very cananiform like teeth, like very canine like teeth up front. Another member of this group, Gomesrai, has been noted to have a skull that would have been very good for resisting the stresses of twisting. So when it was feeding, twisting its head, which is notably different than the shaking that we tend to see in a lot of modern crocs, which could mean that it's going after smaller prey. Many of these have been interpreted as maybe insectivorous or
Mhm.
going after small animals of around that size. Another member, Manzanensis, has bulbous back teeth, which we do see in like modern alligators, which probably means it was going for tougher food. It might have been specializing in snails or crustaceans or something and going after things that had to crunch up.
A lot of these are demonstrating one of the main features you mentioned earlier, which is heterodonty, having
Yes.
different shaped teeth specialized for different tasks throughout the mouth.
And the fact that each of them seem to have notably different sets of teeth and many of them are found in the same deposits could mean that there was niche partitioning, that you had multiple species of small croc running around eating different things and
Yep.
not competing with each other. So this could be a habitats where we would have seen multiple of these of this genus all eating and living in slightly different parts of the environment. By far the weirdest member and one of my favorites is Anatosuchus minor, duck croc. The duck croc, named for the fact that its snout widens out into this almost leaf shaped, flattened bill with a little hook on the tip. Very, very similar looking to a duck bill. This one is also notable for having long and flattened claw bones and has been interpreted as very likely a digging animal, if not
Yeah.
burrow making, probably digging after stuff. And it's been thought that maybe that specialized snout was a sensory tool, because crocodilians have their pressure sensors, those little dots along their lips and face that they use in water to sense motion in the water. But if their ancestors had something similar, a widened snout like this might make them more sensitive to finding prey in holes that they've dug up and looking
Yes.
for animals that way.
Which is quite similar to the way that a platypus uses its duck-like face.
Yes,
They
absolutely.
go searching around in like the mud at the bottom of streams and stuff.
So Anatosuchus has been interpreted as likely being some sort of digging. It's predatory because it's got very hooked-like teeth, so it's eaten animals, but probably going after small prey that it's maybe digging up.
Cool.
Right? For many of these, the terrestrial habits are suspected due to the heterodont features and the shapes of their skulls. Many of them have very tall faces, even if they're not slim and tall like a predatory dinosaurs, they're still not flattened like a aquatic croc. Some of them we do have limb bones that are very straight and shaft-like, so seems like this group was a mostly terrestrial group. The degree to which can't be confirmed for all of them, because some of them we do not have all the anatomy, but some of them we do have quite good specimens, and they seem to be a mostly running around group. Alongside this group, in fame for at least the one member, is the Mahajanga which only has 2 known members, both notable for different reasons. One is Mahajanga, which is one of the only semi-aquatic members of Notosuchia. This is one of those examples where it seems that semi-aquatic behavior evolved from terrestrial ancestors here. This is a croc from Madagascar, which is another reason that it's often gets noted, is it's a Madagascar creature.
Yes, Mahajanga is named for I think it's the Mahajanga Basin.
Yes.
That Madagascar, because there's also a Mahajangasaurus.
Yes, exactly.
Which is why the audience couldn't see it, but when Will said the Mahajanga, I raised my eyebrows knowingly, knowing what the other croc is going to be.
Yep. This is a relatively large croc. It's about 4 meters, so 13 feet long.
Okay.
It has a very flat head, very classic croc shaped in that way. With some exceptions, the lower jaw is super deep. Like, when you look at the skull in profile, the lower jaw is taller than the top of the skull.
Interesting.
So just this big, like, comic book character chin going on the lower jaw. And it does still have ziphidont teeth. Now, whether this is due to some specific way it was feeding or the fact that it came from ziphidont ancestors, we can't know. But it does have enough other features that seem to indicate a semi-aquatic lifestyle that it is usually reconstructed as very croc-shaped, just with a very unusual face.
Well, this really does drive home the fact that being a land croc was the norm for this time, especially for this group.
Yep.
And so semi-aquatic lifestyle was convergent with alligators and crocodiles that we have today.
Yes. Because by this time, the lineage that would lead to our modern crocs already went aquatic sometime in the Jurassic.
Yes.
So this is in the Cretaceous that this group also moved into the water. They even note that it has a very modern croc-like palate, so the roof of the mouth, which could indicate that that is not a ancestral feature for all semi-aquatic crocs, but a functional feature for being semi-aquatic. That evolves convergently
multiple times.
Yes. The other member of this group is Caprasuchus, the boar croc. One of the most intense metal crocs that has ever been around. Caprasuchus is not from Madagascar. It is actually from Niger. This was found in the Sahara. It is only known from a complete skull. Body estimates put that the croc likely is somewhere between 8 to 12 feet long, so 2.5 to a little more than 3.5 meters. So not huge, not small. This skull is one of the most intense looking croc skulls you will ever see. They have 2 notable bumpy bony horns on the back of the skull. Likely didn't have any like keratin horn sheath on them, but these big projections off the back of the head compared to what we typically see. Then at the front of the face, big cananiform canine-like teeth. They have 2 pair from the lower jaw that stick up past, outside the upper jaw like we see in modern crocs, but they actually can stick almost above the snout height. Like, these are close to being often referred to as tusks.
Yeah.
These are huge, and they've got 4 more on the upper jaw that do the same thing past the lower jaw. Just these big dagger teeth sticking out of the mouth in both directions. That's why it got called the boar croc, because it has tusks sticking out in both directions. It also has fused nasals, and the front of the snout has this weird texturing that some have interpreted maybe had a keratin-like covering, that it has this reinforced snout. And there have been suggestions in the past. I don't think any of these are held highly as likely, but this more is just to get across the idea of how crazy the skull is, that maybe it was ramming into prey with its snout because of how robust the skull is. So big, awesome croc face. Super cool. Some of the teeth are ziphidont, are serrated. So that, along with the fact that it is a fairly tall skulled animal, has led it to be often interpreted as a terrestrial predator. The fact that the eyes are also not on the top of the head, but more toward the sides of the face, like we see in, predatory dinosaurs, and that the nostrils are at the front of the snout and not on the top. All of these lead us to interpret it was terrestrial, but I have seen some suggest it might be semi-aquatic. I saw it listed as an example of semi-aquatic evolution in Notosuchians. We don't have any of the body.
Look, it put all the reinforcement in the skull. So
right?
I assume all of the other bones are just paper thin and they fall apart. All it survives is the skull.
Oh, it's like that old game where the crocodile dentist game where you had to press the teeth down and it was just a giant head and this little body behind it. That's what Caprasuchus was. It was 90% head. That is really all there is to say about Caprasuchus. For as awesome a croc as it is, we don't actually know a ton. I don't think we have any other Caprasuchus skulls. That initial specimen, I think, is still the only one we have.
Interesting.
So hopefully go dig in Niger some more, because I need to know more about Caprasuchus.
Very cool. Astute listeners will note, as I'm sure Will also intuited, not the croc I thought we were going to talk about.
No.
Which makes sense because of the timeline. And I thought that it was, because you were like, and now this, and I was like, we jumped all the way ahead in time. No, we didn't. We'll get to that croc later. Yeah.
That croc comes a little bit later. That one is coming up soon. Another group of Notosuchians, the Sphagosaurians, are a group previously known as the advanced Notosuchians.
They hoverboards and stuff.
Right, exactly. They were using computers. They are a well-preserved group, so we know a lot about many of the members. Notosuchus is one of the members in this group, Notosuchus terrestris, which is the first ever described Notosuchian.
And you can tell because the species name is terrestris.
Yes.
Which reflects the surprise of the scientist who went, wow, this is a croc that walked on land.
Weird. What a weirdo. You should get your own group. Yes, I will collect all the rest. These are almost entirely known from South America during the late Cretaceous, most from the Bibaru group in Brazil. These have been noted for being terrestrial due to many of the similar things of their limb features as well as skull shapes. There is one thing that also might correspond with them being terrestrial, in that there are some burrows found in Brazil that seem to be the right size for some of these smaller sized Sphagosaurians, and could be linked to Notosuchus having very robust front limbs.
Okay, so another potential digger.
Yeah, there's also abrasion on the front teeth of Mariliasuchus, another member of this group, that has incisor-like front teeth that stick out the mouth.
Oh, like a mole rat.
Like a mole rat.
Yeah.
So it doesn't sound like we found one of these crocs in a burrow yet, but we have burrows of the right size. We have one with strong front limbs, and we have one that seems to have mole rat-like front teeth. So we might have some literally burrowing crocs which is also not insane because modern crocs today will form burrows.
Yes.
So even if you're not super specialized, you could be a good burrower still. So perhaps we also see a ton of feeding diversity in this group. Some predatory members. One, Capirasuchus, which had heterodont teeth, and they noted even that the front teeth seemed to be good for biting, for piercing and seizing, and the back teeth for processing food. So a very
Okay.
mammalian setup of grab with my front teeth, chew with my back teeth. We have some that have globodont, rounded teeth. Adamantinasuchus, which likely was eating tougher food. They noted specifically in that one that it seems like it could be good for like scavenging, that the
Okay, for
shape of
like
its
bone
teeth.
cracking and stuff.
Yeah, that it might be good for processing bodies. Morenosuchus has very cananiform teeth and is inferred to have a robust bite force with globodont like back teeth. So, likely a very effective omnivore eating a variety of things. There's even coprolites known from Meriliasuchus that I mentioned earlier that show apatate and calcite, which corresponds to a carnivorous diet, and potassium, which corresponds to an herbivorous diet. So that one also seems to likely be an omnivore. And multiple herbivorous members. There's multiple different members. Even Notosuchus itself seems to likely have dentition that leans toward herbivory, though it's been interpreted different ways in the past, but it has dentition that fits and a weird snout morphology. It has a wide depression at the front of the nasal that has been interpreted as either having fleshy lips, like upper and lower lips, that might have been good for manipulating stuff, or a small hog nose or trunk.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, flexible lips. My go-to is things like rhinos or giraffes,
Yes.
where it's not like a taper trunk, but their lips are good at grabbing and wrapping around stuff. Camels do this too, which is great for manipulating plants and things. Interesting. So that it's really interesting to think about these herbivorous, specialized land crocs because we don't get a lot of specialized herbivorous reptiles in the modern
Yes.
world. So the closest comparison that really exists for a medium to large sized herbivorous land reptile are tortoises.
Yep.
And when you said it has a depression I was like, does it have a beak like a turtle?
Right? Yeah. It had something going on,
If you can't have a beak, flexible lips will do a similar job.
which is so alien to picture on a croc.
Yeah.
Super weird. Capirasuchus also is notable because it had tooth batteries kind of going on, where it has these very flat and wide teeth, and the front of the snout, so the two sides of the lower jaw come together like a slender snout croc, but for a shorter, not as long. But that way, the teeth on either side of the jaw end up being right next to each other to create this wide, flattened, crushing surface.
Fascinating.
Yep. So, like, being an herbivorous croc didn't just mean that they were, flatter teeth. Some of them got weirdly specialized.
Yeah, and similar in some ways to the molars of herbivorous mammals or the tooth batteries of herbivorous dinosaurs.
Exactly. So, effective herbivores, which is awesome. Next group of Notosuchians is the Barusuchidae. The Barusuchids, very well known group of terrestrial crocs. This includes Barusuchus, which is one of the most famous members. This is a group from late Cretaceous, South America, mostly large predators. This is a mostly large bodied predatory group. They have basically every feature that we would look for to indicate terrestrial lifestyle. Less osteoderms, straight, robust limbs, reduced tall skulls, xiphodont teeth. They even have things like the space between the radius and ulna is reduced. They are closer together. Well-developed toe bones for taking on the forces. This one also has the positioning of the eyes and the nose that indicate not being in water. They also noted a high olfactory ratio, So they have a good sense of smell, which modern crocs do as well, but I saw it noted here. This is the group that has the one member that is Prisarachamsa. This is the one member that seems to have an absence of osteoderms, which could be maybe an extreme adaptation to terrestrial lifestyle, but all the group shows reduced dermal armor. Most of the group have serrated cananiform-like teeth, skulls that seem like they had the ability to produce strong and prolonged bites, even robust claws. So potentially able for pinning or helping to hold prey while dismembering. They've also found remains of Sphagosaurians in the abdominal cavity of one of the members, Aplestosuchus, confirming that they were eating their cousins, and coprolites that are inferred to be Barosuchids from Barosuchids have bone fragments in them. So
Cool.
this was a highly predatory group. I did see it noted that many of them have been found, though, with gastroliths, the stomach stones, which is a little unexpected, since one of the uses for stomach stones in modern crocs is buoyancy, which a terrestrial croc shouldn't need. But the other reason that is thought that they swallow stones is also to help grind up food. So that could still be useful for terrestrial crocs.
Yeah, birds do that.
Exactly. So not unreasonable, just not what we necessarily expected to see. Now, this group is with an overall group within Notosuchia called the Sebecosaurians, which might sound familiar to some people because this also in this group with them is one of the most famous specific groups of terrestrial crocs, the Sebekids. This is the Sobek crocodiles. This is also notably the only group of Notosuchians to survive the Cretaceous. These are the members that make it to the Miocene and very earliest Pliocene. Most notably, the ones that did survive, very similar to the Triassic extinction we talked about, are the less specialized members of Sebekids that tend to have a higher number of teeth compared to the more specialized Barosuchids. And so those are the ones that made it across. And then many of those evolve back into top predatory animals. We start to see that happen in the Eocene, where they become more specialized. They start to get that more tall, skulled shape. We tend to see a reduction in the teeth to be a more specialized dentition. And we start to see some very specialized predatory members. These again, are mostly known from South America, though there is a European group of Sebekids also known. This likely means that they either dispersed in the Jurassic and then independently evolved similar groups in Europe and Asia, in South America before everything split apart. But it's also difficult to determine exactly what the relation is between these two groups because a lot of convergence can muddy the interpretations. Once again, they have the suite of terrestrial features, long limbs and all that good stuff, laterally compressed snout, the orbits being not on the top of the head, powerful femurs, ziphidont teeth, expanded semicircular canals, which is that inner ear, which we've often noted before talking about semi-aquatic groups, that you tend to see a smaller inner ear in semi and fully aquatic groups. And isotopic studies have confirmed terrestrial habitats for some of these members. The features of the skulls of some members, specifically one being Sebecus, the famous genus, are inferred not only to be terrestrial and predatory, but potentially ambush predators.
Okay.
Due to many similarities in the shape of the skull to Komodo dragons.
Oh.
That they seem to be specialized for rapid, powerful bites. So quick bites, but also a strong bite. And this is supported by evidence of the jaw musculature. And so they likely were acting as terrestrial, land-based ambush predators, the same way a monitor lizard sitting, in the underbrush waiting for an animal to pass by, which is not insane. We see that in today's crocodilians. Alligators, I've heard noted waiting alongside deer trails on land because if I only have to jump a foot to grab your ankle from the bushes, that's still pretty good. I've also seen it noted that based on the features of the teeth and the skull, that Sebecus and some other Sebesuchians likely were feeding more similar to theropod dinosaurs just due to how many similarities there are between the skull and jaw structure. They even noted that the type of serration they have is very similar to theropod dinosaurs, most similar to tyrannosaurids, in that both have the rounded projections that are the denticles, the big serrations on the teeth, and then in between are these sharp clefts that are called diaphyses, and that this setup is a very effective, meat tearing and cutting tooth, but that we see it a very similar structure in both groups. So they were probably at least biting and feeding the same sort of way.
Yeah, like a quadrupedal tyrannosaur.
Yep, which fantastic. Wonderful. Speaking of that concept, some of the largest members, we have Dentanosuchus from France and Barynosuchus from South America. These are very large. Now, exactly how big the whole animal is not known, because I believe both are just known from skulls, or
Mhm.
at least partial skulls. But based off the size of the skull, they either have very big heads or are a very big sebecid. The typical skull size for most sebekids is going to be around 40 centimeters, so 16 inches long. Not bad, decent size. Like that's bigger than a wolf skull. That would be a big bite. For Dentanosuchus, the lower jaw is 90 centimeters long, 35 inches long. So almost
Oof.
3 foot long lower jaw. And that is similar in size to Barynosuchus, which is about 70 centimeters long at 28 inches, which is 28 inches long. And the skull is about 16 inches high, 41 centimeters. We don't know how big the body was. Estimates have ranged based off of proportions of other sebekids, that this could be somewhere between 6 to 10 meters, so 20 to 33 feet. But other estimates have been much more conservative, 3 to 4 meters, so 9 to 13 feet.
Okay.
So it could, and they noted with those smaller sizes, they just likely had a proportionally bigger skull, just a
Right.
disproportionate sized head.
So full body length, somewhere between uh-oh and yikes.
Yes, but big, like either way, a skull that's almost 3 feet long for either of these members, that's a powerful predator. So
Yeah.
these were dominant land predators, and they noted for Dentanosuchus that either way, it makes it the largest land carnivore in Europe during that
Mhm.
time. Like, regardless of which way you split it, that is one of the largest land predators in that area of the world during this time, which is awesome.
Very cool.
Fantastic. There are some other members of Notosuchians that don't fall into these, nice bigger groups. Pachysuchus, I saw mentioned, which is a Cretaceous Notosuchian from Tanzania. Small bodied. It has a short, wide skull with notable heterodonty, so lots of fancy teeth. The back teeth are very molar like, molariform, and suggest an amount of occlusion, so teeth on tooth action, that is unprecedented among crocodiliforms, as the paper put it, meaning that they likely had a very efficient chewing or biting surface. And they noted that the level that we see in the way the teeth meet up is much closer to what we see in mammals.
Okay.
So it had molars much more like a mammal than it does like any crocs,
Cool.
and means that it could have been filling some of the roles of small mammals where it was living, and maybe acting like a little or herbivorous mammal. And then the final Notosuchian to mention is the best, Simosuchus clarki.
There it is.
My little puppy croc.
From the latest Cretaceous of Madagascar.
Yes, absolutely. Also from Madagascar. This is my favorite. Simosuchus was a small crocodiliform, typically 0.75 meters, so 2.5 feet. So that's getting to the smallest sizes of today's crocodilians. It has a very unusual head. Like, its body looks very much like a terrestrial croc. It's got longer limbs that stand more upright, very much what you would expect there. Snout is even weird for most terrestrial crocs. Its head is wide and very short, and it has the widest head to length of any crocodilomorph we know of. I don't know that it's wider than it is long, but it's close.
It's almost square shaped.
Yep. It's slightly downturned. The snout is slightly downturned. They've compared it very often to pug, which is where the name comes from, pug-nosed crocodile. The teeth are very clearly herbivorous teeth. This is one of the most famous and undisputed herbivorous crocodilomorphs. It is also unusual for having really intense osteoderms. It has osteoderms along the back, like most crocodilians. It also has osteoderms along the belly, which some modern ones have, but it also has them down the legs, which is not common in crocodilians.
Yeah.
So it has sleeves of osteoderms as well as a back covering.
Yeah, I don't even think that was common in ankylosaurs.
Yeah, this is a very heavily armored little crocodiliform.
Yeah, I assume that they were rolling up like armadillos.
Yes,
They're
absolutely.
rolling around their habitat.
Yes, because if anything, there's only more reason for them to be extra cute. They have robust limbs with feet that are proportionally small, but with large claws.
Okay.
Which has led some to interpret them as maybe diggers and maybe burrow makers. This seems like it has been back and forth in the research, with some interpreting them as diggers due to the claws and that the shape of the face might have been good for pushing dirt out of the way. We see many animals that use their face as a shovel, basically, but others have argued that it doesn't match the morphology of other head first burrowers, as they called them, which I love, and that it's some of the limb elements don't show digging adaptations, but others have then pointed out that modern crocodilians, once again, are quite adept burrowers. So we don't necessarily need Simosuchus to be shaped like a mole for it to have been making its own burrows, but there's also not robust, indisputable evidence that it was burrowing. So, popular idea for Simosuchus, not a confirmed one. And that is the last of our Notosuchians. By far, one of the
very
most
successful groups.
Yeah, this is a extremely successful group that is mostly terrestrial crocodiliforms.
Yeah. For most of the last 150 million years or so, this group has been around somewhere. Some ecosystems in the world have had these monitor to way bigger than that land crocs roaming around in their ecosystem. These basically little quadrupedal theropods.
Yep, which is so cool. We do see some other terrestrial crocs outside of the Notosuchians. When we move into the Neosuchians, one step yet closer to our true crocodiles, these show up in the early Jurassic and do have some groups that are noted as potentially being terrestrial. Far fewer, because we are getting into the lines where these are the few remaining members, and then eventually this group mostly is semi-aquatic. There are the Atoposaurids, which are small-bodied crocodiliforms found in Jurassic and Cretaceous of Europe and Southeast Asia. Their teeth are very similar in a lot of ways to a lot of lizards. So they've been interpreted as having similar diets, some of them eating small animals and insects, others potentially being herbivorous, though there's been debate. So diets that typically lean us toward interpreting a terrestrial lifestyle. There's also the Para-alligatoridea, which are, once again, small members found in Asia and North America. These two groups are either sister groups or slightly more distantly related, but they're probably pretty close. At least one member, Tarsomordio, has very straight and long, thin limbs, which seems like a very terrestrial setup. It also has teeth that look like it was more omnivorous or durophagous, eating tough stuff due to its heterodont features. So once again, seems likely terrestrial. Those are the only ones I saw mentioned outside of Notosuchia and outside of Eusuchians, which is the true crocodiles. Eusuchians include our modern groups. This is right up. This is now, if you get any smaller, you're getting into our modern groups or their closest cousins. There are a few members of our of our true crocodiles that seem to have returned to a terrestrial lifestyle. These are the very rare examples that we mentioned early on that seems like they have evolved semi-terrestrial or fully terrestrial lifestyles. One is Armborgia, which is a small croc from North America and Europe during the Eocene. It's inferred as likely being some kind of alligatorid and is known just from one specimen that has a taller skull and therefore looks a bit more terrestrial in that shape. It's more often inferred as probably being semi-terrestrial, more like dwarf crocodiles that we mentioned earlier. So probably not running around on land, but maybe feeding on land more often. This is based off of its features and its locality seem to support that. One feature they mentioned that I thought was interesting is they mentioned the numinization of the skull and the ear canals, but that its head posture seems like it would have been a more alert head position. A posture that the head would be effective at seems like one that would make more sense out of the water. So probably a little bit more terrestrial. The Planocranidae is a group from the Paleogene of Asia, Europe, and North America. This group used to be called the Pristichampids.
Okay.
This group got renamed. These are quite terrestrial. These are the hoofed crocs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, quite famous group. They have blunt claws on the end of their toes that look much more hoof-like than claw-like. And so they've often been called the hoofed croc. Now, we don't think that they were walking on the tips of those hooves like today's hoofed animals,
Right.
but that it had toes that were specialized in a similar way for moving around on land. They also have long legs. Their tail has a round cross section based off interpretations. It doesn't seem to be laterally compressed like we see in today's crocodilians. They also have ziphidont teeth. They did have more extensive body armor, so more armor than you would typically expect for a terrestrial croc, but that could be because they came from semi-aquatic ancestors. These got to some okay sizes, 2 to 3 meters, so 6 to 10 feet. There's only 3 genera known: Bovarisuchus, Planocrania, and Durosuchus from Europe and North America, China, and Europe, respectively. Outside of them having ziphidont teeth and being predatory in that regard, not much else is known about how they lived, but likely terrestrial predators. They've often been compared to monitor lizards again, so secondarily terrestrial crocs. In this case, we can just say crocs.
Mm-hmm.
The most famous members, though, that did the same thing of becoming secondarily terrestrial are the Mechasuchinians.
Yep.
This is an Australian group known from the Eocene to the Holocene. It is suspected that likely the last Mechasuchians died out around 3,000 years ago.
Which is yesterday.
Almost. We almost had running crocs.
Yeah, like that's not very many generations of human ago.
Yep. Insane. So unfair. Many of this group are still semi-aquatic. Most of them seem to have pretty normal crocodile shape. Their hips seem to be similar to our modern crocs. There might have been some that seem to have slightly more terrestrial capabilities, limb bones that were a little bit straighter than modern crocodiles. So they might have been a better high walker, something like that. There are some that are interpreted as being fully terrestrial. Mechasuchus, Trilophosuchus are 2 that are often cited as being much more terrestrial, sometimes closer to semi-terrestrial like dwarf crocodiles and caimans. And then one, Queen Kana, seems to be fully terrestrial. Definitely, they've compared it typically to Sebekids and Planiocranids. So very similar. It has a skull that looks exactly like those other groups. Very tall, very narrow, ziphidont teeth. The positioning of the nose and the eyes, all of it fits to being a terrestrial animal. There's no postcranial minus some hip bones that do seem like it would fit more to being erect stance, but we don't have much else than that. Quincana was also about 3 meters long, so almost 10 feet long, so decent sized predator. And even among the other members that are less terrestrial than Quincana, we still see some slightly more terrestrial features. Some of the ones we already mentioned, as well as like some of their feeding mechanisms, seem like they might have been feeding more on land. Trilophosuchus was mentioned to have that seem to have features of the neck that suggest motions of the head that would fit better with terrestrial posture and movements of the head than one that was closer to the ground like modern crocs. So this could be one of those groups where they were better walkers but were still swimming, and could, like, even Quincana, who is definitely a specialized for walking around, could still have been an adept swimmer. And that actually goes for any of the previous groups we've mentioned. There's no reason they wouldn't have been excellent swimmers, because like modern iguanas are
Mhm.
excellent swimmers, even though they are not aquatic animals in the slightest for most of them. Most of them are
Yeah.
tree dwellers, but if they fall in the water, they swim quite well. So this might be one of those groups where it is, you get a range of, I'm really good in the water, I like it right next to the water, I like it on the land, and
Right.
everything in between.
Like we were saying earlier, there is this spectrum of landedness to wateredness, and terrestrial crocs as a concept tends to be everything from like Cuban crocs onward
Yes,
in the landward direction.
absolutely.
So, like, there, I wouldn't be surprised if there have been some of these terrestrial crocs that rarely, if ever, went in the water. If you
Yes.
had some that lived like a lot of modern animals, well, like elephants or rhinos, animals that can swim
Mm-hmm.
and will hang out near the water for various reasons, but aren't necessarily going for a swim on the regular. Or maybe like a tiger or a lion is a better comparison, because we're
Yeah.
talking predators. Like, yeah, you can swim and you might even chase something into the water if you
Yeah.
are so inclined.
Well, like a tiger, you might be a good swimmer, like,
Absolutely.
but that's not where we're gonna find you 90% of the time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of those jaguars that, jaguars, again, great swimmers,
Mm-hmm.
not typically considered aquatic animals, but they will hunt aquatic prey when the opportunity arises. So I wouldn't be surprised if we had some of these terrestrial crocs that were like, yeah, you'll see them in the water on occasion, but they're really not typically in there. And then others who might have lived much more like tapers do today,
Yeah.
where they are excellent at walking and they're feeding on land, but they spend, when they're not feeding, they spend as much time as they can in the water because they like to be in the water.
Yeah, that's where I rest, and that's where I'm safe, because
Yes.
I feed on land, but I can outswim all my predators. And I can't
Yes,
outrun all
exactly.
of them, but I can outswim every one of them. Well, and like Simosuchus is a great example. Simosuchus also has a notably short tail for its body
Hmm.
size. So like it could not be a good swimmer like most crocs, where it's using its tail as the main propulsion, because it had a very short tail compared to its body length. It could be swimming like a dog.
Yeah. It's also covered in armor,
Yeah.
like extra armor that I assume was, if not weighing it down, at the very least limiting its mobility.
Yes. So there are some that probably were not good in the water,
Hmm.
and you probably had the whole range. Well, and like many of their ancestors, probably like Adasaurs,
Yes.
probably weren't swimming. They are big armored land herbivores, probably weren't good swimmers. A lot of the Rauisuchians were super terrestrial. As whenever we get into them, you'll see some of them were bipedal. They were running around on two legs. They have no indication that they were even thinking about the water.
Hmm.
So there's a whole bunch in here where definitely many of these groups, like the history of semi-aquatic crocs is a strong and long one, but it is probably a disservice if we let that too much color the way we interpret these other crocodilomorphs, many of which, like the Notosuchians, only have like a couple of semi-aquatic members in the entire group.
Yeah. Yeah, the history of crocs, they have been much more like what we think of like lizards or turtles,
Yes.
where there have been aquatic and semi aquatic members and some that are really good in the water, and even some that have gone all the way to marine, but they have largely been animals that are very capable on land.
Yes. Yep.
Which is very cool. It's a fun topic because it's one of those examples where we make a whole big deal, and this whole episode is terrestrial crocs, because today that's an unusual. It'd be like if we had a discussion about limbed snakes.
Yes, exactly.
And it's like, yeah, today that's very unusual to think about. But in the Cretaceous, that's just what snakes were.
Yeah, that's how you were a snake.
Yeah. In the Mesozoic, terrestrial crocs was, that's just one of the main ways to do croc.
Yes. Well, and the thing that makes it so fun is that it means that in certain parts of the world, from the Mesozoic to the Miocene, you just had both. Like,
Yep.
you had crocs at the riverbank, but you also had crocs running around the forest, probably. And like, that was just, they were in both places. And in some places, like South America famously, and Australia, they were some of your biggest predators. Like, on land, they were some of the biggest predators that you would be unfortunate to run across on the open or closed environments on land. And that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, South America seems to have been the place to be if you
Yes.
wanted to encounter land crocs, which is funny because that's also, Cuban crocs today are often cited as the most terrestrial of our living crocs, which is unrelated. These are unrelated groups at completely different times, but it is funny that that is a little note of consistency.
Well, and it makes the great example that, people will very often ask of, well, do you think we would ever see this re-evolve? And as demonstrated with these last two groups, yeah, probably. Like, very likely becoming a terrestrial croc again is something that has happened in two different groups. And terrestrial croc is a type of animal that has been successful for a huge span of time on our planet.
Yeah, it's similar to our discussion from episode 214 about saber-teeth.
Yes.
Where it's like, we happen to be existing in a fairly unusual time where we don't have this thing.
Yep.
But it was very common in the past, and yet in all likelihood, we will get it again in the distant future.
Like, if in a handful of million years from now there's not like a saber-toothed weasel, I'll be surprised.
And same if there's not some land crocs.
Yes.
Especially if we continue wiping out other large land predators.
Right?
Just freeing up those niches.
The environment.
For making the planet warmer. We are creating a croc world.
One more reason that we all need to do our best to save the Cuban crocs, who are currently being outbreeded by American crocs and are on the brink of disappearing. So, sign up for the croc and snake.
Sign up for croc and snake tiers to donate to crocodilian conservation efforts and secure a future for terrestrial crocs.
And speaking of Patreon, our last section of the episode is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions submitted by one of our patrons to answer here on the podcast for all of you. What's our question today?
This episode's patron question comes from a patron called the Lannister Thylacaleo, which I assume is a lion-like marsupial with sandy blonde fur.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Who always pays his debts. Who asks,
sends their regards.
do we see the exact same niches in similar biomes in different locations? For example, would you find squirrel-like animals in temperate rainforests of Asia like you would in the Americas?
Excellent question, and very fitting to this episode where we just talked about the many instances where a very similar lifestyle in crocodiliforms has evolved. For the most part, kind of, yeah, we can expect to see very similar lifestyles and roles show up in similar ecosystems or habitats, regardless of where it is or what time we look at it. Like in the past, we'd also expect to find similar things. It is not a definite rule, because
Right. If you go to a rainforest, you're not going to see all of the same mold of each and every species.
yes, and there's definitely times where you'll get exceptions because it depends on what level you're looking at in the role of the animals. Because if you're looking for small tree animals, absolutely. If you're in an environment with trees, you're going to find small tree animals.
Right. Well, and it's interesting the example that they cited of squirrel like animals in Asia and the Americas. Not only do you get squirrels in both places,
Mhm.
but you even get things like flying squirrels in
Yes,
both of those forest ecosystems.
exactly. But if we're looking at, for specifically squirrel like in a small animal that lives in the trees and eats nuts, then you can only have that in forests that produce nut like structures for them to be eating. Otherwise, they're going to have to be tree dwellers that eat nectar or tree dwellers that eat small animals or some other thing like that. So the more specific you get, the less likely you are to find perfect parallels all the time.
Right.
But you
But
will
it
get,
is
like you said with the flying squirrels, extremely similar adaptations in similar habitats sometimes.
And it, especially when we're comparing modern ecosystems, it can be tricky because in some cases, it is that two different groups of animals have occupied a very similar niche. But in other cases, it's that one group of animals has spread around the world.
Yes, exactly.
So, like, sticking with the theme of this episode with crocodilians, there are alligators in Southeast North America and Southeast Asia living in fairly similar habitats with a very similar lifestyle, but those are very closely related animals. That is
Yes.
because that is a group that once was spread more across the Northern Hemisphere, and these are the two that are left. Whereas you will also get other cases like in Australia and South America, you will have possums existing in niches very similar to what you see rodents doing in other.
Yes.
You have gliding possums where you might otherwise have gliding rodents or something. But when we look back through the fossil record through time, it is extremely common for us to be able to find multiple animals at a fossil site and go, this isn't the same as this modern animal, but it seems to have been doing a very similar job. This seems to
Yes.
have been like a deer or like a lizard or like whatever, because these are the lifestyles that work.
Yeah.
And so they tend to show up over and over again.
Well, and the so to speak physics of an ecosystem hasn't actually changed. Like energy demands, what it means to move around in an ecosystem. Like if it's still a forest or it's still a desert, then the challenges are the same. And if the challenges are the same, you're going to often come across the same answers to meet those challenges. It's the same with human culture, where it's like we did not correspond to both create projectile weapons. But we both realized if I can hit my prey from over here, that's better than being next to it. So we
Yes.
invented the spear, the bow, the sling, the atlatl, all these different things to do the same job.
And it's even more likely when you're comparing mammals to mammals or reptiles to reptiles because they're working with the same foundations. Right? It's
Yes.
very easy for mammals to continuously hit upon the same solutions. So, yeah, if you visited a North American forest and made a list of every species there and then traveled to a very similar Asian forest, you probably wouldn't be able to find an exact match for everything on your list, but you
Mm-hmm.
will find a match for probably most of the things on your list. At least a
Yeah.
pretty good match.
Well, and you'll definitely get situations, and this is why we have to be careful not to apply these one to one comparisons too aggressively, because you will definitely get situations where it's like, this animal's doing like 75% of two different roles.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's doing a little bit of this other animal that we would normally see, and a little bit of this other animal that we would normally see. And it's kind of combined them into a new way to cover that, but there's not a one to one. There's no other animal we know of that's doing it that way.
Right.
The job is still being covered, so to speak, job in quotes, but that ecological niche is being filled, but it's being filled in a very different way. So you'll
Right.
definitely get examples where you can't always say, oh, that's like one of these, because it's really like half of that animal and half of that animal.
Yes. Or you could even have it where it's like, yeah, this is the local insectivore, but if the local insects are different enough, then
Yes.
it's going to have to live somewhat differently just because its prey is different.
Yeah. And you get things like the kiwi, which is a small terrestrial bird in a place where there aren't rodents. So it's kind of filling that small animal in the underbrush eating insects. It is in no way similar to rodents in most regards,
Yes.
but it's doing that type of job there because there's no one else to do it. So you'll get some instances where it is this what you're talking about, but they aren't actually super comparable animals.
Yes.
Great question. Very fun topic to think about. Thank you for submitting that. If anyone else is interested in submitting a question for us to answer, check out the description and join our Patreon, where you can get all these bonuses and goodies and support us. Check out the blog, where you can see images and links to all the info we discussed here and extra bits if you want to learn more about terrestrial crocs. Once again, we are in Croc Month, so the Croc chat on Discord is still open. You can go there and share all of your crocky thoughts and feelings and pictures. If you haven't joined the Croc tier on Patreon yet, it's still available, so you can donate there and participate in our support of croc, snake, and national park conservation this year. Thank you to everyone who requested this topic. Thank you to all of our new patrons, and extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, Daniel Loves Bugs, and Bugs All the Way Down.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions and your participation at all levels.
And with that, for a very rare thing for me, I don't have anything more to say about Crocs at this moment. I have.
I mean, if we give it a minute,
right.
If we stall for a minute, you'll come up with something.
Another thing about why Simosuchus is so great.
Well, let's walk on out of here. Let's high walk on out of here.
These Crocs were made for walking. That's just what they'll do.
All right, there you go. That's not too bad. Someone's got to make like Simosuchus Crocs, like the shoes.
Yes,
like little Simosuchus.
Oh, just little spiky armored shoes and a little derpy wide face on the front.
Absolutely.
Yes, I would wear nothing else.
We release episodes every fortnight. Think about that. Now we can leave.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.